Okay. Page 716. One second, let me have a little sip before I start. Okay. Therefore, it was safer to take money from Moses than from the city. A politician or public official could accept a legal fee or an insurance premium from Triborough with assurance that no reporter or reformer would ever be able to discover that he had done so. The state or city comptroller could, in theory, make the discovery. The legislation creating Triborough authorized in-depth audits of its books by these two officials. But there was no precedent for such an audit. None had ever been undertaken. And there were reasons, both practical and political, to doubt that one ever would. One was the very size of Triborough. Auditing the authority would require a huge staff working for a long time. One estimate was 50 accountants working for a year. And no comptroller had that kind of manpower to spare, so the job would require a sizable appropriation from either Board of Estimate or state legislature, a highly unlikely eventuality since any comptroller seeking to pry open Triborough's books would be asking for the money to do so from the very men whose names were in those books. The comptroller's party designation was irrelevant. Because members of both parties were in those books, his audit would inevitably embarrass members of his own party. The secrecy cloaking Triborough's largesse was also protected. It's also protected its recipients because the secrecy protected the man who proffered that largesse. Since 1924, newspapers had, practically unanimously, been describing Robert Moses as a man above politics and deals, a man whose name it would be ridiculous to mention in the same article with any hint of payoff or scandal. After the war, the New York Post, with publisher Dorothy Schiff taking a more active interest in the paper, began to question not only Moses' ends, but his means. Asked to inspect Triborough's records, and when Moses refused to open them, took him to court. But the courts upheld Moses' refusal, and without those records, the Post could not document its suspicions about the flaws in the Moses image. And for a solid decade after the war, despite the wishes of an occasional reporter or editor, no other newspaper attempted seriously to dig behind that image. Moses' personal reputation was reinforced by that of the institution with which, increasingly, it became blended. After, as before the war, the public was being informed by Moses and by the press in a single 6-year period, 1946 through 51. There were more than 1,400 editorials in the metropolitan area newspapers on this theme, that public authorities were not only prudent, practical, businesslike, and efficient, but non-political, outside of politics, and therefore honest. Authorities are free from political considerations, the Times said. They are free from the dead hand of partisanship and bureaucracy, the Herald Tribune said. Moses' reputation and that of the institution he did so much to bring to maturity was the final guarantee that the secrecy of its books would remain inviolate. A politician considering accepting a Triborough fee could be assured that should some neophyte legislator ever attempt to open Triborough's books, Moses would assail the attempt as an attempt by a politician to interfere with an agency whose independence he didn't like and to get his hands on some of its funds. That the press would back up that argument and that the public would be conditioned by years of praise for Moses and for public authorities to accept it. Politicians could be sure that no public official solicitous of his political future would lay that future on the line in a fight with a living legend. Asterisk. Only a comptroller who held his duty above his career would conduct the first audit of Triborough, and that comptroller, Arthur Levitt, would not come along, either city or state, for almost 20 years. When he did, and unable to secure the necessary appropriations from the legislature, in 1966 scrapes together a skeleton crew of his regular staffers to make at least a limited study, in the first in the history of Triborough, of the authorities' books. The findings would, if publicized as widely as the Moses legend, have disproved that legend. But the findings were hardly published at all. No one could disprove Moses' reputation without first opening Triborough's books, and nobody could open Triborough's books without first disproving Moses' reputation. Any public official thinking about accepting a Triborough retainer could feel certain that his own reputation would be safe in the shadow of Moses's. Robert Moses had $750 million of authority money to spend. In the ultimate analysis, it was the public's money. But Robert Moses was not accountable to the public. He was not accountable to anyone. He had $750 million to give away, and nobody would ever know to whom he gave it. And this made politicians and public officials, at least those politicians and public officials interested in retainers, all the more anxious to make sure that he gave some of it to them. Such politicians and public officials noted another fact about Moses' money, which, in their eyes, made it even more attractive than the city's. Moses could give it to whomever he wished. Expenditure of most federal and state money, slum clearance money was a notable exception, may have been largely free from city control, but it was subject to control by federal and state bureaucrats. Expenditures for highways and low-income public housing, for example, were subject to requirements for competitive bidding and to rigid standards, minimum and maximum, on the work involved, and to certain auditing to ensure that those requirements were met. To a certain extent, it was possible to circumvent those requirements, and to the extent it was possible, Moses did circumvent them. But the extent was extremely limited. The bureaucrats in Washington in particular were grimly stubborn about sticking to the letter of the laws they were charged with administering, and the threats of audits to discover violations of federal regulations was a constant inhibiting factor to potential violators. But over the spending of Triborough money, Moses enjoyed absolute discretion. Edward N. Costikyan was a keenly observant Reform Democrat who suddenly found himself able to observe the machine as no other reformer had ever observed it, as its leader. New York's political convulsions of the 1960s catapulted him, to his own amazement and that of Tammany Hall, into the Hall's chairmanship and kept him there for more than 2 years. And Costikyan, upon descending from his unique vantage point, was to report, "The magnet which attracts corruptors, the natural locus of corruption, is always where the discretionary power resides." In New York City, in the post-war era, the discretionary power resided principally in Robert Moses, and like filings to a magnet, or more precisely, like flies to a sugar bowl, the corruptors, the men who possessed influence over the city's political or governmental apparatus and who were willing to sell that influence for money, were attracted to Moses and to the seemingly bottomless sugar bowl for which he possessed the only spoon. And Moses did not send them away disappointed. Free from political considerations were in fact the basis, the only basis, on which Moses spooned out his millions. With the power to distribute those millions according to any criteria he chose, during the entire post-war era, he chose mainly a single criterion: how much influence an individual had and how willing that individual was to use that influence on his behalf. The distribution of the insurance premiums on the Single Moses Slum Clearance Project demonstrates the use of this criterion. During the mayoralty of Vincent R. Impellitteri, who came after, it was LaGuardia, then Harriman, then Impellitteri. Okay, during Impellitteri, the insurance was handled by one of Impellitteri's bankers, Robert Blakey. No sooner had Impellitteri lost his bid for re-election to Robert F. Wagner Jr., the hand-picked candidate of Tammany boss Carmine DeSapio, than Blakey lost the insurance account to a banker associated with DeSapio. And the overall pattern of the distribution of the Triborough Authority's insurance, a pattern revealed by secret records which the public has never seen, demonstrates the criterion even more strikingly. The authority's policies carried premiums of more than $500,000 per year, or a yearly profit to brokers of more than $100,000. And the brokers who received this profit had to do almost no work for it. Spargo was to note in a secret internal Triborough memo that once the big insurance, the policies insuring Triborough's bridges and tunnels against collapse or destruction, had been placed with insurance companies, little, if any, work on the part of the broker was required. In 1954, almost 20 years after some of these policies had been written, Spargo could say, "To my knowledge, the authority has spent millions of dollars on premiums and has never filed or collected a claim." Wow. Good thing none of them fell down. Francis Scott Key Bridge, this would not have worked. During the LaGuardia era, there was little political profit to be reaped through the sowing of such policies. What there was would be reaped through the Democratic machine, and some of Triborough's insurance, therefore, was given to C.J. Reed and Company, a firm whose office was on Vanderbilt Avenue, but whose connections were on 14th Street, and Reed's general practice was to parcel out its commissions to key Tammany figures. But another major hunk of the insurance was given to the state insurance fund, without any broker at all being involved, and still another was given to a broker with no political connections, for no other reason than that he had been an old Army buddy of Spargo's predecessor, General Loser. We've had so many names, but General Loser is a crazy... Okay, wait. An Army buddy of General Loser. So General Loser was in the Army. Okay, well, that's... With the machine back in power, however, all this changed. The Triborough policies formerly held by General Loser's Army buddy and the state insurance fund were snatched away and given to a new broker. Okay, so General Loser lost them. In a frank because he believed it would remain a secret forever, internal Triborough memo, Spargo was candid in explaining a key reason for the choice of the new broker. Because he was a friend of Tom Shanahan's. Shanahan was Tammany's chief behind-the-scenes financial manipulator for close to a decade, until the mid-1950s. For a decade, the policies were left with Shanahan's friends. The Reed Company was allowed to keep its policies, but a closer watch was instituted to ensure that its farming out of commissions resulted in the maximum political influence for Triborough. By 1954, Carmine DeSapio had solidified his control of Tammany, centralizing in himself more power than had been enjoyed by any boss since Charlie Murphy. He and he alone called the shots for the machine, and it sometimes seemed for Wagner. Sometime in 1954 or 55, DeSapio, the Tammany guy, was invited for a luncheon at Randall's Island. On returning to his office later that afternoon, he told a friend that he had found only two men present when he arrived, Moses and Spargo. And DeSapio told a friend, after mentioning that they knew he was connected with a certain insurance firm, they had offered that firm all Triborough's insurance, the entire $500,000 per year in premiums and $100,000 per year in commissions. DeSapio told the friend that he had turned the offer down. He told me, the friend recalls, that he was not prepared to exert the degree of influence over the administration and the mayor he felt would be required of him in return. That he was not unprepared to exert a lesser degree of influence is indicated by the fact that some Triborough insurance began to be given to a new broker, one whom key Democrats considered close to the leader. But DeSapio's refusal to accept it all left a lot of the commissions to be disposed of. Steingut, son of Steingut, spiritual heir to McCooey and boss of the Brooklyn organization that the one-time butcher had carved into shape. See, we're really getting some crazy characters out here. Okay. I don't even know who Steingut is, except son of Steingut. And because a public authority was not, by customary definition, part of government, could piously tell an inquiring reporter that he had never accepted government business. So that's what Steingut said. So did the Democratic leader of Queens, the Honorable James A. Rowe. In 1953, the year in which the Herald Tribune was stating that authorities are free from politics, 3 of the 5 county leaders of the machine that dominated the city's politics were therefore on Moses's payroll. There were enough insurance premiums left over for Republicans, and at least one of the GOP county leaders, John R. Cruz of Brooklyn, received some of them. As for the legislature, Moses used insurance premiums to ensure that his influence there would be exerted not only indirectly through the influence of Rowe, Steingut, and DeSapio over the legislators they controlled, but more directly through at least one of the small group of leaders who really ran the legislature, D. Mallory Stevens, a poor farm boy from Putnam County who, in 1942, became chairman of the Assembly's key Ways and Means Committee, which controls the flow of legislation to the floor, and in 1943 began receiving Triborough insurance business. Stevens continually pressed Moses and Spargo for more business, telling them frankly that the influence he was using on their behalf entitled him to it, and no matter how much he was given, he was never satisfied. So insistent became his demands that in a secret memo in 1953, Spargo told Moses, "The only way you can satisfy Mallory Stevens is to give him the business now handled by Shanahan's friend." The dilemma was resolved by Stevens' decision to leave the legislature for a bank presidency. Okay, I'm really not keeping track of all these characters very well, but okay, let me just. Okay, so they're trying to satisfy the Mallory Stevens person, which is like, I think, was that the Brooklyn guy? That was the okay, sorry. D. Mallory Stevens was the poor farm boy who was the Ways and Means Committee guy. Okay. Now we have a footnote. Anyone wondering why Moses' fellow Triborough Authority commissioners proved so complacent, might perhaps find a clue to part of the answer by looking at Triborough's insurance premiums. The family of Charles G. Meyer, Triborough Commissioner from 1945 to 50, was the largest stockholder in the Home Insurance Company, a major recipient of premiums from the Moses Empire. George V. V. McLaughlin, Triborough Commissioner from 1934 to 65, and it's written out George V. parentheses the fifth. That guy was a director and major stockholder of the Equitable Life Assurance Society, another major recipient. For the first 28 years of his commissionership, McLaughlin invariably rubber-stamped Moses' decisions. In 1963, for personal reasons, McLaughlin took the stamp away, showing signs of increased independence. Moses took the premiums away. In 1963, he transferred the policies involved to Hartford Life. In Triborough's secret records, Moses stated that the reason for the transfer was that Equitable had requested a 15% increase in premiums. An indication as to whether or not this was actually the reason may perhaps be found in Moses' reaction to similar Equitable requests in previous years. On March 1, 1959, for example, Equitable was given a long-term Triborough insurance contract for $20,000. Exactly 1 year later, Equitable requested and received a 35% increase in this premium. Okay, that was really not that. That was fine. I was expecting a better footnote. Yeah, I cannot keep track of these characters. A charting of the legal fees, but I guess that's kind of the point, because it's like they're paying off so many random people. I don't think it really matters who all these people are. It just matters that they're paying off a bunch of random people through insurance. A charting of the legal fees and other I don't know this word. And other emoluments. It means a salary, fee, or profit from employment or office. Synonym, payment. Okay. A charting of the legal fees and other emoluments that Moses distributed to lawyers during the post-war era, a year-by-year analysis of who got the fees and when they started getting them and when they stopped getting them, provides almost a year-by-year chart of the fluctuations in the political influence of certain key Democratic lawyers. The influence of two lawyers did not fluctuate. During the entire post-war era, no matter which Democratic factions were in power, it remained year after year steady and immense. And year after year, these two lawyers received a steady flow of legal fees, immense legal fees, from Moses-controlled enterprises. One was Samuel I. Rosenman, who, as a hustling young lawyer, a quartet of a century before, had needed a boost from Moses just to stay in public service, and who had begun drafting speeches for gubernatorial candidate FDR, and who in the decades since had become an advisor to presidents, a small but crucial part of history. So this is Samuel Rosenman. In 1970, a political advertisement seeking to capitalize on Rosenman's endorsement in an election told voters, "When Sam Rosenman talks, you should listen. Roosevelt did, Truman did, Lehman did." A judge, a president of the association, so this is more about Rosenman. He's a judge, a president of the Association of the Bar in the city of New York, a figure of prestige so awesome that it seemed to blot from the memory of even old acquaintances the fact that he had once been Sammy the Rose, Jimmy Hines' assemblyman, a representative in Albany of one of the most notorious of all the old line Tammany leaders. The other was a less public figure. Okay, so that guy is really influential. Cool. The other was a less public figure. Monroe Goldwater was a playmate of Ed Flynn's boyhood. And Flynn was just like a random. Wait, I think Flynn might be the guy I looked up yesterday who was like he had a special name, but it was like the big boss of the Bronx or something. Okay. So blah blah blah. Goldwater, what's his name? Monroe Goldwater. When in 1922 Flynn became boss of the Bronx, Goldwater, his little boyhood friend, a skilled attorney, became the boss's law partner. Okay, great. During the decades in which Flynn made the power, Goldwater made the money. Millions, perhaps tens of millions, for both of them. During Roosevelt's presidency, Flynn was forced to spend considerable time on delicate presidential missions. When Flynn was at Yalta or in Moscow, Goldwater kept Flynn's machine in line. Flynn's death in 1953 seemed almost to increase rather than diminish Goldwater's influence, freeing it to spread beyond the Bronx until it permeated every center of power in the New York democracy. A courteous man with a gentle, benign manner, Goldwater was nevertheless master of any political situation, no matter how rough, a fact that could be ascertained with remarkable speed by a contractor whose campaign contribution did not meet Goldwater's expectations. Wagner selected the quiet, elderly lawyer to manage all three of his mayoral campaigns. Okay, Goldwater, rich lawyer guy with connections. Moses was not interested in Rosenman's prestige or Goldwater's skill with a brief. He was interested in their behind-the-scenes political clout, and he knew that in post-war New York, they possessed more of that commodity than any other Democratic attorneys. Enormous, he would say of Rosenman's influence. He never talked about Goldwater publicly if he could help it. And both of them were consistently on his team. Rosenman was his personal attorney, a job for which he may or may not have received a fee, and special counsel to his authority, a title Moses modeled on the one, special counsel to the president, under which Rosenman had served Roosevelt and Truman, on a retainer described as very substantial. And a retainer was only one of the emoluments Rosenman received from public works with which Moses was connected. A single Title I developer, for example, gave his law firm a legal fee of $250,000. Other attorneys possessed of lesser amounts of political influence received Triborough legal fees, but smaller fees handed out in precise ratio to the amount of influence over the city's governmental structure that they possessed. As Charles J. Perouse became closer and closer with Mayor Wagner, for example, he received larger and larger portions of Moses's largesse. If many of the key Democratic politicians in New York City seemed organized now into a retainer regiment, it was Robert Moses who was leading the regiment out. In lockstep, Moses's fees did not come free. There was a price attached. He was buying men's influence, and for every dollar he spent, he made sure he received in return the full value. The price was not demanded outright. Moses did not directly ask recipients of his fees to return the favor by voting in legislature or city council for one of his proposals, or by persuading legislators or councilmen to vote for the proposal. He did not ask them directly for support of any kind. Asking would have placed both him and them in violation of the law and of various codes of ethics, and he neither performed himself nor asked anyone else to perform any illegal act. Few of the recipients of Moses's fees were as blunt about the services they were expected to render in return as Mallory Stevens, who asked late one night by his Albany suite mate, Reuben Lazarus, why he invariably supported Moses's legislation while opposing that backed by Austin Tobin, replied, "Because Tobin doesn't give me anything." The exercise of influence was seldom as dramatic as Samuel Rosenman's hasty plane trip to Albany in 1957 after Harriman announced that he would veto Moses's St. Lawrence Power Project because of the... Who is at the door? Do you know who it is?
No.
It's a mystery. Okay, so Rosenman is on a hasty plane trip to Albany in 1957 after Harriman said he's going to veto something because of the preferential contract terms it offered big aluminum producers. On Moses's instructions, Rosenman flew to the Capitol, went to see the governor, and on the same day persuaded him not to veto Moses's proposal. Moreover, no evidence had been found of specific fees being given for specific favors. Moses did not Moses did not operate by demanding direct quid pro quos. Rather, it was a case of being on his team or not being on his team. Politicians and office holders who consistently supported his proposals were considered on the team, and men who were on the team were generally also on the payroll. And the overall record is very clear. When a mayor or a governor turned to a man on Moses's payroll for advice, often not knowing that the man was on that payroll, the advice given was invariably the advice that Moses wanted given. When a Moses proposal was before a city or state legislative body, legislators secretly on Moses' payroll or controlled by men secretly on Moses' payroll were generally the legislators pushing hardest for adoption of Moses' proposal. If Moses was purchasing influence, these men were peddling influence. In terms of money, the terms in which corruption is usually measured, Robert Moses was not himself corrupt. He was, in fact, as uninterested in obtaining payoffs for himself as any public servant who ever lived. In the politician's phrase, he was money honest. But in terms of power, Robert Moses was corrupt. Coveting it, he usually used money to get it. And because he had so much money in his fields far more than the city, and so much freedom in his fields far more than the city, in spending it, within the city he became the locus of corruption, money corruption. Consider his relationship with Tom Shanahan. Shanahan's nostrils twitched to a single aroma, the smell of money. Even as a boy at the turn of the century, one of 7 children of a poor Irish Boilermaker, he had found that scent to its source. He followed the scent to its source. The noses of his Waterbury, Connecticut playmates may have been flattened against candy store windows. Tom Shanahan's nose was pressed against the glass front door of Waterbury's Colonial Trust Company. Reminiscing 40 years later, he would recall vividly passing that building almost every day of his youth and staring inside almost every time he passed. It had been, he would say, a place of august halls. From as far back as he could remember, he would say he always wanted to be a banker. He followed the scent down to the great city after high school, but for long years he seemed to have followed it into a trap. The tall, strong young man spent 7 years behind the barred windows of tellers' cages. He went to NYU at night. In 1926, earned a degree, but 5 years later, he still had a job only slightly better, assistant cashier, as one of the smallest and shakiest banks in the city. The 8-year-old Federation Bank and Trust Company, okay, that's the bank. But when, in 1931, the Depression forced the infant institution to shut its doors, it was the assistant cashier who, with Federation's despairing offers ready to liquidate, thought up a complex refinancing plan that reduced the bank's obligations, personally talked a financier into loaning it the money to pay them off, and saved the bank. When it reopened, Shanahan, at 29, was its vice president and treasurer. With authority, Shanahan was able to move Federation into a field from which more conservative bankers shied, loans to construction contractors. The age of huge construction companies was still in the future. During the Depression, most of New York's contractors were small and broke. Quote, Tom would take a contractor who didn't have the salary to pay his workers that week and back him, an associate recalls. He went on face value, and he very seldom was wrong. He backed Peter DiNapoli. The story around Federation in later years was that when DiNapoli first came in to see Shanahan, he had to borrow a nickel for car fare home to Queens. And the Slattery Contracting Company, which was better off but barely, and a half dozen others who were to make immense profits and who deposited those profits with Federation. He proposed giving junior officers of the bank greater responsibility. More cautious elements protested. The bank, after all, had only one office. Shanahan told them not to worry. He'd bring in the business, he said. He just wanted to make sure there would be people around trained to handle it. He was as good as his word. By 1944, Federation had $30 million in assets, and increasingly, Federation's assets were his assets. For years, he had been quietly buying up the bank's stock. When in 1944, the one-time bank teller was elected president, he owned shares worth millions of dollars. Shanahan's rise may have been as dramatic as one of Horatio Alger's heroes, but it was less publicized. He shunned fame with the same diligence with which he had sought wealth. Not a single newspaper or magazine story provides more than the most cursory details of his life. And he had reason to shun fame. Since 1941, his activities had involved politics as well as banking, and his political activities were not ones that would appear attractive in the spotlight. It was not for principle, but for profit that he had entered politics. His political philosophy seemed to have begun and ended with a violent hatred of commies. The expression on the big Irishman's face would contort into a snarl, and the eyes behind the steel-rimmed glasses would glitter with rage when he discussed the left-wing conspiracy that he felt was trying to take over the city. Planning to name him a delegate to the 1952 Democratic National Convention, friends would be embarrassed to learn that he was not eligible because he had not bothered to register to vote. But his dealings with contractors had shown him that their dependence on governmental contracts could be turned to personal financial advantage. The contractors owed Shanahan much. He transferred part of that debt to the Democratic Party, raising so much money from them for the party's 1941 mayoral candidate, William O'Dwyer, that when O'Dwyer decided to run again in 1945, he made Shanahan his campaign manager. And soon after O'Dwyer was sworn in, a pattern in which politics and profit were intertwined, began to emerge on Shanahan's loom. The contractors he had persuaded to contribute to the Democratic Party were being handed lucrative construction contracts by Democratic governmental officials and were depositing the profits from those contracts in his bank. In 1948, I think I'm going to do one more paragraph, but I like this Tom Shanahan stuff. This is actually interesting. In 1948, when Shanahan was 46, O'Dwyer appointed him with an absolute minimum of publicity to the City Housing Authority. Housing Authority memberships were non-paying, but in Shanahan's case, that adjective may have applied only to salary. Within a remarkably short time after he was sworn in, the word was out around town, not only among contractors, but among architects, landscape architects, engineers, insurance brokers, real estate appraisers, among, in fact, every profession whose members wanted work from the authority. You had to do business with Tom Shanahan, do your banking at Shanahan's bank, and kick back a portion of your profits to Shanahan, presumably for the Democratic Party, or forget about your chances. And even after you obtained an authority contract, the word went, your business with Shanahan was not finished. When you submitted the bill for your work, further payoffs would be required, or somehow the bill would keep getting lost in the authority's files, and you would not get paid. The banker quickly became, in the word of one Reformed Democrat, one of the most notorious boodle boys around town. Okay. Warren Moscow, who was able to do his perceiving from an excellent vantage point, he was an executive director of the Housing Authority for 2 years, could say of the banker, he was a very personable guy, but I would say that ethically Tom left something to be desired all the way down the line. It was common knowledge. No, I won't say common knowledge. It was common gossip that an architect who wanted to get an assignment from the Housing Authority had to turn $15,000 over to Tom Shanahan, there theoretically for the Democratic Party. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Goodbye.